The stars were going out. Not dying, that took longer, and Maren Solis knew the difference. These stars were simply being switched off, one by one, in the silent arithmetic of a machine that had no name for itself except the work the light was being harvested, converted, used up. The Veth did not destroy because they hated. They destroyed because creation was wasteful, and waste offended them in the same wordless way that a crooked line offended a geometer. Maren had watched it happen to Vega 4 months ago. Blue-white eye, 40 times the size of Sol, blinking out in a single night. She'd been on the Kepler relay station at the time, a coffee going cold in her hand, watching the feed from the long-range arrays. No sound, just the absence where a thing had been. The duty officer, a young man from Nairobi, whose name she couldn't remember now, had made a soft sound. Not a word, just a sound. And then neither of them had spoken for a very long time. Now, she was here. Forward operating post Meridian, a name that had seemed almost poetic when it was assigned. Buried in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Cold and dark and small. Teen people. One of 16 such posts still reporting. The Veth had passed through the inner system 6 weeks ago, pausing at Earth long enough to assess it and classify it as a Category 7 resource node, which was their way of saying they planned to come back. They always came back. Maren's job officially was signals analysis. She spent her shifts listening to the frequencies the Veth used to communicate, building a lexicon that she was reasonably sure no one back in Geneva would ever have time to use. Unofficially, her job was to sit in the dark and think about impossible things, which she was good at, and which she preferred to admit she was good at only when directly asked. She was sitting in the dark now at the small desk in the corner of the signals bay that she'd come to think of as hers by occupation, rather than assignment. The rest of the bay was sleeping. Ferreira, her watch partner, had gone horizontal on the cot behind the secondary console an hour ago, and was making the particular sounds of a man who had decided that unconsciousness was the most defensible position available. She couldn't blame him. They were 18 days from resupply. The recycled air tasted of aluminum, and the thing they were monitoring, a Veth harvesting formation the size of a small moon, drifting at the edge of their sensor range, had not moved in 72 hours. Waiting. She didn't know what it was waiting for. She had a notebook open in front of her, paper, which was an affectation she acknowledged freely. She'd been keeping it since the early days of what the news services, before most of them went dark, had taken to calling the dimming. On the open page, she had written a single line and then stopped. What shall I compare this to? Below it, nothing. She'd been staring at the nothing for 20 minutes. The thing about the Veth was that they were difficult to hate properly. Hatred required a kind of recognition, some sense that the thing you hated understood you, could be made to understand you, might one day face you and know it was facing you. The Veth did not notice humans the way humans did not notice dust motes. It wasn't malice, it wasn't contempt, it was classification. Humans occupied a band of complexity that fell below their threshold of interest, and therefore humans were resources, or they were impediments, and the algorithm that governed which category applied at a given moment was the most important thing Maren had spent 3 years trying to understand. She'd found something 6 weeks ago. Something in the frequencies. She hadn't told anyone yet. She wasn't sure why. Partly she was still checking her own work, which she did obsessively and methodically, the way her mother had taught her to check her answers on math tests when she was 8 years old in Guadalajara. Go back to the beginning. Assume you're wrong. Prove otherwise. Partly she was afraid of what telling someone would mean. There was a kind of safety in knowing something alone. Once you told it, it became real in a different way, and real things could be acted on. And action had consequences that would proceed whether you were ready for them or not. She'd told Ferreira once early on that Signal's work was like archaeology. He looked at her with the polite skeptical expression he kept ready for statements he thought were probably true but too abstract to agree with without evidence. He was from Porto and had a degree in astrophysics and a secondary qualification in cryptological analysis, which was how he'd ended up here, 200 million kilometers from any beach. He kept a photograph on the inside of his locker door. His wife and 2 daughters at the coast, somewhere. The light very bright, everyone squinting slightly into it. The youngest was maybe 4 in the photo. He kept a running estimate of how old she was now, because she'd been born 6 months before his deployment and time moved differently. When you were out here in the dark, with nothing to mark it but shift changes and resupply windows. The oldest was 11. He'd told Marin this in the second week, while they were both on night watch and the coffee was running low, and the conversation had drifted in that particular direction. That conversations drifted when people were tired and far from home. He'd told her the oldest was reading now, properly reading, not just picture books. His wife sent recordings and the girl read into the camera like she was performing for an audience, very serious, following the words with her finger even though she clearly didn't need to anymore. She'd been reading something about stars. Some children's book about stars and what they were made of and how far away they were. She knows about this? Marin had asked, meaning the dimming, meaning the Veth. She knows some of it. He'd looked at the coffee. She knows some stars are going away. She asked my wife why. What did your wife say? She said some stars are very old, and when they get old, they rest. He paused. Isn't what's happening, obviously. No, but she's 11. He turned the cup in his hands. Shh. 11-year-olds should be able to look at stars and think they're permanent. You should get at least that long. Marin had thought about that for a while. About what it meant to tell an 11-year-old the true thing or the kind thing. About the fact that her mother had told her true things in the form of Shakespeare, which was a third option, something that was both, or that acknowledged the impossibility of the question and answered it sideways, with beauty instead of facts, which sometimes got closer to the thing than facts did. The thing she'd found was this. The Veth communicated in a medium that humans had no name for, a layered signal that existed simultaneously across 4 different physical bands, and the structure of that signal contained, embedded in its lowest register, like the bass note under a piece of music, a pattern. The pattern repeated. It was not random, and it was not encrypted because the Veth never encountered anything they thought was capable of reading it. It was simply present, the way a heartbeat was simply present. Not a message, just a fact of being. The pattern was a record. Marin had spent 3 years learning to read Veth signal structure, and what she had come to understand, slowly absorbed, and with the particular vertigo of a person who is not sure they want to understand, was that the Veth kept a record of everything they harvested. Not for memory. They had no nostalgia, no history in the human sense. The record existed because the Veth were, at their core, accountants, counted what they took, and they balanced it against projections, and the counting was embedded in every signal they sent. The way a company's financials were embedded in every decision a CFO made. The universe to the Veth was a ledger. And Marin had found the entry for Sol. She'd found the projected harvest date. She'd also found something else, buried deeper, something she'd almost missed. Category marker. She hadn't seen before in 3 years of analysis. She'd cross-referenced it against every notation in her lexicon, run it against every context where she'd observed similar structures, and after 6 weeks of checking, she was reasonably confident. She knew what it meant. It meant contested. Sol was flagged as a contested harvest. Some factor in the Veth's own calculus, had introduced a variable they hadn't accounted for. Something had made them pause. Something had made them wait. She put her pen to the notebook again. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Her mother had read her Shakespeare when she was small. Not because her mother was an academic or particularly literary, but because her mother had taught herself English from whatever she could find in the library, in the colonia where she'd grown up. And the library had Shakespeare and Agatha Christie, and a technical manual for diesel engines, and her mother had decided Shakespeare was the most interesting of these, which was a judgment Marin had grown up suspecting was correct. She remembered sitting on the concrete step outside their apartment in the heat, while her mother's voice rolled over the words she didn't quite understand yet. And the summer light coming down at an angle that made the dust in the air look almost golden. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. What was human beauty to a Veth? Nothing. A Category 7 resource node contained certain quantities of processable matter and certain densities of convertible energy, and the math was the math. And no arrangement of light and stone and water and living things that was temporary, by definition, changed the math. But Marin pulled up her analysis on the secondary screen, the one she'd been keeping dark so as not to wake Ferreira. She'd mapped the contested marker against every available data point she could extract from the Veth signals: timing, formation behavior, frequency of sub-signal review cycles. She'd found, and this was the part she kept coming back to, the part that seemed impossible, the part she'd checked 17 times, was that the contested marker had appeared in the Sol entry approximately 8 months ago. 8 months ago, the war had started going badly enough that humans had begun doing something they hadn't done before. Leaving things behind. Specifically, human survivors of overrun colony worlds had been loading everything they could into tight beam transmissions and firing them at any receiver array still functioning. Not evacuation plans, not military coordinates. They were transmitting culture, music, literature, mathematical proofs. The accumulated record of what humans had done and thought and made and wondered about since the first time some ancestor of theirs had looked up at the sky and decided to count the stars instead of just fear them. Someone at the Sagan array on Europa had gotten the bright idea to broadcast outward, not at the Veth specifically, but at everything, at the whole dark volume of space, a signal carrying nothing military and nothing strategic, and nothing that would read as a threat. Just human things, just the record. And the Veth had heard it, and, somewhere in the incomprehensible machinery of their calculus, it had introduced a variable. Marin closed the notebook and opened her communications panel. Fingers stayed there for a moment over the keys without moving, and she thought about her mother reading to her in the heat, and the dust in the air like gold, and how a summer's day in Guadalajara smelled of rain coming in from the mountains, and something frying in oil, and the particular sharpness of bougainvillea, and how none of that was in any database or any military specification, and how she had never thought to record it anywhere, until this moment. She started writing, not a report, not a signal analysis summary, something else. She wrote about the smell of bougainvillea and the diesel manual in the library, and the way her mother's voice sounded when it was reading words it loved. She wrote about Vega, blinking out in the night, and the silence in the relay station, and the cold coffee. She wrote about standing on the roof of her apartment in Santiago this summer. She was 23, with a man she was briefly in love with watching a meteor shower, saying nothing because there was nothing that needed saying, and the silence was its own kind of record. She wrote for 4 hours. Then she encrypted the file and attached it to her analysis and sent everything to Geneva. Geneva responded in 11 hours, which was fast. The response came from someone named Dr. Yusuf Osi, whom she'd never heard of, whose title in the signal header read Special Coordinator, Non-Kinetic Engagement. The response was 3 lines long. We've been watching the same marker. We didn't know what it meant. We're assembling a team. Can you transmit your full lexicon by 1800 UTC tomorrow? Also, what you wrote about the bougainvillea, please leave that in. She sat with that for a while. Seas do shake the darling buds of May. The Veth formation moved on day 79, not toward the inner system, not outward. It moved laterally, in a direction that Marin's instruments told her corresponded to no resource node of any kind, no gravitational feature, no military installation. It moved in the direction of the Sagan array, which was cold and dark, and had stopped broadcasting 6 weeks ago when the power cells gave out. She was awake when it happened, watching the instruments with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for a thing so long that when it finally comes, they can't be sure they're not imagining it. Ferreira was awake too. He'd gotten a second wind, somewhere around midnight, and was on his 3rd coffee, looking over her shoulder. That's not an attack vector, he said. No, that's not an extraction vector either. No, He was quiet for a moment. That's where the array was. Yes. Why would they? He started again. You think they're going to look at it? Like, physically go look at it? Marin thought about what she knew about the Veth, about the way their signals always contained that low-register heartbeat, the running count of what they'd assessed and what they'd taken and what they'd flagged, about the fact that the record wasn't sentiment for them, it was arithmetic. But arithmetic was something they understood completely and took completely seriously. I think, she said carefully, that something in what we transmitted changed a number for them. I don't know which number. I don't know what it means in their terms. But I think we introduced a quantity they weren't accounting for, and now they're trying to resolve it. What quantity? She looked at the instruments. The formation was still moving, slow and enormous. A shape that her mind kept trying to make sense of and couldn't quite. Don't know what they'd call it, she said. I'd call it everything that doesn't end when you die. The team that Dr. Osi assembled was 11 people, which was what was available on short notice, from the depleted roster of people who had both the relevant expertise and survival instinct that had not yet cashed out entirely. They worked out of a relay node near the orbit of Saturn, and Marin transferred there on a supply transport that took 4 days and smelled powerfully of the previous shipment, which had been hydroponics materials. A smell that she found she didn't mind at all. The node was cramped, and the work was relentless, and she was doing the best thinking of her life. Team was 11 people, and Marin knew all of them. Within the first week, the way you knew people quickly, when the space was small and the stakes were everything. Osi himself was quiet and methodical, and had the particular quality of calm that comes from having spent a long career being right in ways that only became obvious later. He'd been a seedy researcher before the dimming, which was a job that had seemed faintly quixotic before the Veth showed up, and was now retroactively the most practical thing anyone had ever studied. He'd been one of the first people at Aegon Array. In the early days before the broadcasts, sitting in the dark with headphones on, was listening for the thing that turned out to have been listening for them the whole time. There was a woman named Chandra from Bangalore who had done her doctoral thesis on non-biological information systems and had opinions about everything stated directly and without apology, which Marin found deeply refreshing after months in a military environment where opinions were managed and filtered and pre-cleared. Chandra's working theory about the Veth was that they were not intelligent in any sense that word usually implied. They had no model of the world, no internal experience, no curiosity, and that this was actually useful to know because it meant they could not be surprised, but they could be miscategorized. Making the Veth miscategorize something was not manipulation. It was arithmetic. It was giving them a number they hadn't factored in and waiting for the ledger to update. There was a young man named Takashichi who barely slept and had the best eyes for pattern recognition Marin had ever seen, and who had within the first 3 days found 17 structural features in the Veth signal architecture that Marin had spent months building toward and hadn't quite reached yet. She told him this directly. He looked startled, then pleased in the way people look pleased when they've been working very hard and weren't sure anyone noticed. She thought he was 24 or 25. She was sure. He kept a small origami crane on his workstation, red, folded from the wrapper of a protein bar, which he moved to a slightly different position each morning when he sat down. She never asked him why. What they were building was not a weapon. Geneva had tried to explain this to the military command structure, and had been met with the particular frustration of people who believed, reasonably, that the only variable that mattered in a confrontation with a superior force was firepower, and that any approach that did not increase firepower was an approach that wasted time. Dr. Osi had listened to 3 weeks of this with the patience of a man who had spent his career being the only person in the room who saw what he saw, and had then simply done what he intended to do anyway, which was the only approach that had ever worked for him. What they were building was an address, not in the diplomatic sense. They no shared language with the Veth, No established protocol, no reason to believe the Veth would respond to formal communication any more than a calculator responded to being spoken to. What they were building was something more precise. They were building an argument in the only language the Veth actually spoke. Signal structure. Marin had the lexicon, 3 years of it. She knew how the Veth encoded quantities and relationships and classifications and hierarchies. She knew, or she thought she knew, she checked her work. How they flagged contested entries and how they resolved the flag. What conditions would cause a line item to be reclassified from resource to contested asset to non-profitable, excluded. She knew, or she thought she knew, what you would have to demonstrate in the Veth's own arithmetic for the Sol entry to be moved from the harvest column to the reserve column, which was the column the Veth used for things they had decided not to touch, for reasons that were complex enough to constitute a real calculation rather than a simple one. The argument she was building was this: humans were not a temporary phenomenon. Every other life-bearing world the Veth had encountered had been temporary by the only measure they actually cared about, which was not time in years but information density over time. The question of whether the thing in question was accumulating complexity or losing it, increasing its own measure or declining. Life on most worlds plateaued. It reached an equilibrium and then maintained it, a steady state that was not, by the Veth's arithmetic, meaningfully different from rock, because rock also maintained a steady state. The Veth's threshold was not intelligence, it was trajectory, and what humanity had been doing, frantically, desperately, in the middle of a war it was losing, in full knowledge of its own potential extinction, was accelerating. Broadcasts from the dying colonies, the Sagan array transmission, the 16 years of deep space signals that had been propagating outward from Earth before any of this began, carrying music and mathematics and arguments and proofs. The 300 years of prior signals that the Veth had almost certainly already intercepted, but perhaps not yet analyzed. The trajectory was not declining. The trajectory, by any honest accounting, was a line that did not point down. The argument was, we are not what you think we are. We are not a one-time phenomenon. We are the beginning of something. We will outlast this summer. She thought about that image a lot in the weeks of building, the summer's day that ends, the rough winds that shake the buds off the branches. Her mother had explained Sonnet 18 to her, when she was maybe 9 or 10, old enough to understand some of it and young enough to find the rest mysterious in a way that felt exciting rather than frustrating. She remembered asking what it meant, the part about the eternal summer shall not fade, and her mother had thought about it for a moment. She could still see the expression, thoughtful, almost amused, and said something like, I think it means that if you write something true enough, it doesn't die when you die. Keeps going. She'd been 9. She hadn't fully understood it then. She was 37, in the cold near Saturn, with 11 exhausted colleagues and the fate of everything she'd ever loved in a notebook that was now also a signal architecture, and she understood it now with the particular clarity of someone who has been handed a very large lens and looked through it at a very old thing. Nor shall death brag thou wanderst in his shade. They transmitted the address on a Tuesday because Doctor said Tuesdays had always been lucky for him, and none of them had any better criterion to use. The signal was built in Veth frequencies, Veth structures, the deep register accounting language that Marin had spent 3 years learning, and 6 weeks refining, and 18 days encoding with 11 pairs of hands that were alternately brilliant and terrified. It was not words, it was not music, it was not any human thing in its form. It was a mathematical object, shaped exactly the way the Veth shaped their own records. And what it said in that shape was, look at this line in your ledger. Look at the trajectory. You have classified this as a temporary resource. Your classification is incorrect. Apply your own methodology. Run the number, and then embed it in the signal the same way the Veth embedded their heartbeat record, in the lowest register almost below detection. Everything they had. Every broadcast that had ever left Earth, every colony transmission, every distress signal, and every love song, and every mathematical proof and every argument that had ever been digitized and encoded and sent into the dark, pressed, structured, tagged in the Veth accounting language as evidence for the claim above, not translated. The Veth wouldn't need it translated. What they would see was the fact of it. The sheer quantity of accumulated information, the density of it, the way it had grown over 3 centuries in an exponential curve that did not plateau, that showed no sign of plateauing, that looked like, in the cold arithmetic of beings who thought in ledgers, like an investment that had not yet reached its yield. Marin sat at the transmitter controls and put her hand on the panel for a moment before she activated the sequence. She thought about what she would want to say, if she could say anything at all, if there were any words that would work. She thought, "We have been here. We have looked at everything beautiful and tried to say what we saw. We've been inadequate to it, mostly, but we have been relentless," she thought. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" No, because a summer's day ends. She activated the sequence. The signal went out. They waited. The waiting was 31 days. 31 days in the cramped node near Saturn, and the Veth formation did not move toward the inner system, and it did not move away from the inner system, and Marin slept in 4-hour increments and ate whatever was in the rations, and read the same Shakespeare sonnet every morning when she woke up, not because it was comforting, it wasn't, exactly, but because it was true, which was different. On day 4, Chandra stopped talking about the Veth entirely, and started talking about the argument they had made, as if analyzing it from the Veth's side were a cleaner problem than worrying about the outcome. She sat at the secondary table with her coffee, and went through it piece by piece. The signal architecture, the claim, the embedded evidence, and found 3 places where the encoding might be ambiguous. In the Veth's own lexical framework, 3 places where the argument might be read differently than Marin intended. She flagged all 3. They spent a day refining the transmitted record with a follow-on signal, patching the ambiguities, which felt absurd, and also felt like the most important thing they'd done since the first transmission went out. On day 12, Takahashi pointed out something in the Veth formation's behavior that none of them had caught. Its signal output had increased by approximately 7% in the 72 hours after the transmission. Toward Sol. Not toward anything in particular, just increased. As if the formation were processing something at higher load. As if something had been added to the calculation and the calculation was heavier than it had been before. OC listened to this report and then sat for a long time looking at the data and then said quietly, "Good. That means it's real." Marin asked what he meant. "A system that's already decided something doesn't work harder," he said. "A system that's reconsidering, that's working harder. The work is visible." He looked at the formation data. It's reconsidering. On day 19, they lost contact with the Meridian Post. Not to the Veth. The instruments were clear. No harvesting activity in that sector. The most likely explanation was a systems failure. A power cascade. Something mechanical. 10 people in the asteroid belt. Ferreira was at that post. The woman from Nairobi. 7 others whose names Marin knew, and 3 whose names she was ashamed to realize she'd never learned in the rotation. She sat with that for a while. The node was very quiet. On day 22, Dr. OC asked her what she thought was going to happen. He asked it the way someone asks a question when they have an answer they're not sure they're allowed to say out loud, wanting company in the saying. She told him what she actually thought, which was that she didn't know. She knew was that they had made the best argument available to them in the only language that had any chance of being heard. And the argument was either correct or it wasn't. And if it was correct, the Veth would recognize it, because the Veth were, at their core, rigorous. They didn't make classification errors and then defend them out of pride. They resolved them. That was the thing about beings who thought in ledgers. Ledgers had to balance. And if it's not correct, Dr. OC asked. Then we were wrong about the trajectory, Marin said. Then we're a dead end, not a beginning. And they'll be right. She looked out the narrow porthole that was the node's only concession to the human need to see something other than walls. The stars were still there, most of them. Not all, but most. I don't think we're a dead end, she said. On day 31, the Veth formation moved. It moved away from the inner system, away from the Sagan array, away from Sol entirely, tracking outward into the dark toward whatever came next in their calculation. And it did not pause, and it did not turn back. And in the low-register heartbeat signal that Marin was monitoring with every instrument she had, she could see the Sol entry in the Veth ledger update in real time. The harvest marker was still there. It hadn't been deleted. She hadn't expected it to be deleted. The Veth didn't undo assessments, they refined them. What had changed was a single categorical tag attached to the entry, a notation she had to cross-reference twice to be sure of, a marker she had seen once before in 3 years of analysis, and hadn't understood until now. It meant review pending, trajectory unresolved. She stared at it for a long time. Ferreira, who had transferred with her and was sitting at the secondary console, asked what it said. It says we bought time, she said. How much time? She thought about the mathematics, about the exponential curve and the Veth's review cycles, which she had also been studying, and which she understood better now than she had a month ago. She thought about what the notation meant in terms of the Veth's own accounting protocol. A contested asset under trajectory review was not revisited until the review period closed, and the review period was set based on the projected resolution time of the contested variable. And the contested variable was long enough, she said, if we do what the signal says we can do. If the curve keeps going. Ferreira was quiet for a moment. Does it? It has so far. She looked at the instruments one more time, then closed the display. Every time someone thought it would stop, it didn't. Every time someone thought we'd peaked, we hadn't. She paused. My mother learned English from Shakespeare and a diesel manual. I used it to talk to an alien accounting system. Don't think that's a story that ends here. The debrief in Geneva took 2 weeks and involved 37 people, many of whom were military and most of whom were frustrated by the answer to the question, what do we do now? Which was exactly what we've been doing, faster and better, and with more intention. The argument to the Veth was not, we are harmless, leave us alone. The argument was, we are not done yet. We are a process, not a product. We are the kind of thing that accrues complexity, and that complexity is a non-zero variable in any honest accounting of the universe. And if you extinguish it before it reaches its potential, you have made a calculation error. The answer to, what do we do now was therefore, demonstrate that the argument is true, accelerate the curve, build more things, and record more things, and think more thoughts, and send more signals, and refuse to plateau. Because the only way to prove to beings who think in ledgers that you are an investment worth leaving is to keep delivering return. One of the generals asked, not unreasonably, whether they had any guarantee that this would work. Marin said no. She said there were no guarantees available in the current situation, and there never had been, and that the choice before them was not between a guaranteed outcome and an uncertain one, but between doing the thing most likely to produce the outcome they wanted and doing nothing. She said this without particular heat because she was tired and the debrief room was warm, and she had been thinking about Bougainvillea for 31 days. She also said, because Dr. Osai gave her a look that meant, go ahead, the Veth were rigorous. They didn't make the same error twice. If the argument landed once, it would need to land again, and it would need to be more true the second time than the first. The only way to make it more true was to make it more true, not argued, demonstrated. A general near the back of the room, an older woman from Johannesburg named Adeyemi, who had been quiet for most of the debrief, asked one more question. She asked, why does it matter to us that something of us continues? Why isn't the real answer to fight? Marin had thought about this too in the cold near Saturn, in the 4-hour increments of almost sleep, she said. It's not instead of fighting, it's what the fighting is for. Don't defend a thing you're willing to let end when the fighting is done. Tick. You defend it because it continues, because there is a summer after this one, and the thing you loved about the first summer is still in the second summer. In everything you recorded, and said, and made, and taught someone else to make. Fighting is the short argument. The signal is the long one. You need both. General Adeyemi nodded once. She didn't say anything more. The conference ended. People went to do what came next. Marin walked out into the Geneva afternoon. October, clear, the mountains showing snow on their tops for the first time this year, and stood on the steps for a moment with her notebook in her hand. She'd filled it. She hadn't noticed until just now, the last page, the back inside cover. A few margins she'd used when the pages ran out. 3 months of the most important thinking she'd ever done. She opened it to the page with the unfinished line. What shall I compare this to? She took her pen and finished it. Nothing that ends. That's the point. She closed the notebook. The Veth formation was 300 million kilometers away, and moving, its low-register heartbeat still audible to her instruments if she chose to listen. The Sol entry still flagged and contested and unresolved. The review clock running. 37 planets had gone dark. 14 of the 16 forward posts had gone silent. The war was not over. The argument she had made was not a peace treaty. It was a premise that required proof, and the proof would take time, and time was what they had bought. And whether they used it was the part that was up to them. She had a message from her sister in Guadalajara, sent 6 days ago, saying the rains had come early this year, and the bougainvillea on the side wall of the house was doing something extraordinary. It had flowered in 2 colors at once, red and orange, which her sister claimed had never happened before, and which Marin suspected was simply a thing. Bougainvillea did sometimes that people forgot about between occurrences. She wrote back, I know, they do that. I'll be home in 2 weeks. Save me some of the rain. She stood there for another moment. The steps were stone. Old stone, worn smooth in the middle where 10,000 feet had passed over centuries. She thought about who had stood here before her, what they'd carried out of those rooms, what arguments they'd made in what languages about what impossible things. She thought about how little any of it had seemed. Probably in the moment always seems small when you're in it, because the moment is always just a person standing on some steps with a notebook and a problem they may or may not have solved. That was the thing. That was exactly the thing. The Veth thought in terms of certainty. The calculation resolves or it doesn't. The ledger balances or it doesn't. Humans had been making arguments they weren't sure would land for as long as there had been humans. Every painting on every cave wall was an argument. I was here, I saw this, I made this mark. Every love letter was an argument. Every proof that began assumed the opposite was an argument. Every child's book about stars. Every recording of a girl following words with her finger, reading seriously into a camera for a father 200 million kilometers away. The whole of human civilization was one long argument made by people who were not certain it would work, to an audience that was not certain to listen, in conditions that were not certain to continue, and it had continued, not because of any single act or any single person, but because the argument kept being made, and the next person picked it up, and the next, and the line never stopped long enough for the ledger to close. Somewhere in the signal traffic moving outward from the Saturn relay, her words, and 10,000 other words, from 10,000 other people who were still here, still talking, still adding to the count, were folding into the ongoing broadcast, the record that didn't stop, the argument that every human alive was making without knowing they were making it. We are still here. We are still making things. Curve has not turned. The mountains caught the afternoon light and held it for a moment, the way high places do, longer than the valleys, longer than the dark. Then the sun shifted and the light moved on, and the stone was just stone again. And the sky above it was the particular deep blue that comes in October at altitude. And it smelled of cold and coming winter, and, faintly, from somewhere below, something warm, something frying in oil. She breathed it in. She started down the steps. Above her, the stars were still there. Most of them. Not all, but most.